Correct.
Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. Very informative session this morning. Thanks for inviting us. So I'm Beth Durham from the Bald Head Island Conservancy, and we do a number of things for this island, but most of what I'm going to talk about today is focused on our environmental services contract with the Village of Bald Head Island, kind of informing budget conversations that y'all are going to be having in the next few months. But there are other issues that we'd like to stay abreast of and involved with, including the shoreline conversations. So I found that very informative. But today I'm going to focus on our environmental services contract for the past year or so. We have a number of different types of projects. Some I'm going to spend a little more time on in conversation with Chris. We're going to focus a little bit more on the deer and some aquifer projects today. And then I'm going to briefly review some of our other results, but we'll be providing a full report to y'all towards the end of this fiscal year. So you'll have a nice stack of paper to we'll find facts to read. I wanted to start off with the maritime forest. So as a marine scientist, maritime forests are something that I knew about, but since working here, they've become more and more important in my mind. And the more work that we do here and the more work that we do in maritime forests, the more we realize how important they are and how threatened they are. So our forest here on the island is a globally imperiled community. It has a G2 rank globally. And that means that it's under risk of extinction or elimination. It's actually the second largest maritime forest in the state of North Carolina. And it has a lot of characteristics and species that you just aren't going to find other places. So it's important that we protect the maritime forest. And when I say the forest, I don't just mean the forest preserve. I also mean forest that's out in your neighborhoods and in public spaces and things like that too, protecting those trees. There has been a recognition from researchers that this forest is important and it's potentially under threat since the early 2000s. So there have been these fenced exclosures installed in the forest since about 2007, and they've been kind of in disrepair at times. So they're not always able to assess the things that we want them to assess. But when they are in full force, the idea is that they're excluding deer. So if they're white-tailed deer on the island, they could be, consuming the plants. They're herbivores, they're going to eat all the small vegetation. But putting these exclosures up would allow us to assess what happens when you have deer versus when you don't have deer, and how much of a threat are they on the native vegetation. So the first time that these were assessed was in 2011 by Taggart and Long, and they found no measurable effect. We can talk a little bit about why that might have been. When I got here in 2018, these had not been repaired in a long time, so obviously deer could get in. And in collaboration with Jody Forrester, we reestablished those plots, did a baseline evaluation of the vegetation, and then said, we're going to wait for 5 years. We're going to keep these things up, wait for 5 years, and see if we can see an impact of the deer. The other things that we're able to look at are effects of development, effects of storms, fragmentation, disease, things like that could be impacting the forest as well as the deer themselves. So we've been maintaining those for 5 years with still just support, and then this year is the year that we're doing a plant assessment. So we started this inventory this past year. We have done the understory part, so all the little baby plants and small plants on the forest floor. And what we're finding this year is kind of what we suspected, which is that oak seedlings are very infrequent. So we have lots of large oaks in the forest, but we're not seeing babies. We might see some seedlings, but there are actually no oak saplings. So like the teenage size oaks, no oak saplings in any of these plots. So that's concerning because we don't have the next generation of oaks coming up to replace, eventually when these adult oaks die. There is still some remaining work to be done this next year. So some tree measurements and a deeper evaluation of the different vegetation types and what that means for the health of the forest. But I would say our conclusion is our biggest concern is that oak regeneration failure. We think that we should protect and plant oaks. We have some live oak plants that we could contribute to the cause, but this might be an avenue for the future that we should work on. As I mentioned, deer are kind of the main focus of this study because they can really consume a lot of plants. So the deer have been on this island since the mid-90s at least. And the Conservancy has been involved in looking at deer management since almost that time. And the things that we do for the village include camera surveys and spotlight surveys. We collaborate with scientists in the village to advise on management methods and the science behind it. And then we were the main people involved with the development of the immunocontraception research project, which we'll talk about in more detail later on. And then we were also the ones to carry out the immunocontraception. So this is the non-lethal deer management method that we've used in the past. And just for a little history of deer in Bald Head Island, I mean, if you're up in the United States, deer are everywhere and they seem like a normal thing. But on Bald Head Island, we don't think that they were native here until the 1990s. So there were some surveys done in the 60s and 70s where there were no deer on the island. But as soon as they popped up on the island, people started getting concerned and there was a task force that was established. And then they started almost immediately doing spotlight surveys with the help of NC State. When the first spotlight survey was done, there were 93 deer, and that was seen as a cause for concern. But by about 2 years later, there were estimated to be 316 deer on the island. So that was a huge increase. And that led to the first deer management plan being established, where it was decided that this population needed to start being managed. And at that time, the deer were managed using culls. So there were, I believe, about 6 culls in the early 2000s. And then continued surveys and research by the Conservancy. And then an effort was put forth by the Conservancy and a group called Friends of Deer to start the immunocontraception project. So this was established as a 5-year research project to see if immunocontraception would be effective on the island. It was extended by a couple more years. So that was the method that was used as management during that time up until 2020. And then from 2020 to 2025, there was kind of a pause in management because the population level was under control. And then this past year, the village went ahead and did management by call again, returning to the method that was used in the past. So this is just a quick overview of our survey methods. As I mentioned, we do 2 different types of surveys that are sponsored by the village. We do spotlight surveys in the summertime, and we do camera surveys in the fall. Each one has kind of its pros and cons, but when they're used together, this is how we come up with our population number each year. And here is our huge population graph. Just to walk you through the deer population size. So on the y-axis here, we have our deer population. This light blue, these are the numbers that were determined kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s, before the Conservancy took over the population surveys. So I'm not as confident in those numbers, but those are the numbers that we have. You can see here the numbers of deer that were culled in kind of the early to mid 2000s, 2010s. And then the immunocontraception project started in about 2014 and went to 2020. So here you can see the deer population. There was a cull to kind of start off the immunocontraception project. And then here you can see the numbers of deer eventually coming down under the target numbers. And this is where we stopped immunocontraception because the deer numbers were kind of at a manageable level.
So can I just ask the question here? I don't see a brown or a gray. I don't see the cull figure on the chart, at least as it's showing through here.
Those are the numbers. They're just dots. So their numbers, you say 149.
Thank you.
149.
That's it. Thank you.
I just wanted to point out these targets here. So the maximum population size and the recommended population size. So when I started working here in 2018, the target population size was cited to be 200 deer. And I was told that that was based on that Taggart and Long study that they put these exposures out in the forest. There were 200 deer at the time. They didn't see a big difference between the vegetation in and out of those plots. So that 200 number is what they used. But when I dug into the numbers, that's not really what I found. And then when we talked to Christopher last year, we asking him where he thought that 200 number came from. And he said he thought it was more of a social carrying capacity. So that means like the number at which the public starts getting restless about how many deer there are. They start seeing more collisions with golf carts, or they're concerned about herd health, or the deer are negatively impacting their own plantings, things like that. So 200 seem to be, okay, the island can tolerate 200 deer, but beyond that, it starts getting a little out of control. Social carrying capacity. When you consult the literature about what's recommended for the health of a deer herd on barrier islands, and you take those densities and you extrapolate it to Bald Head Island, you're at more of a number that's closer to 120 deer for Bald Head Island. So that's why I have this recommended population size at 120. And that's a number that we kind of decided on with the village last year when they made a decision to cull that they were going to go for that recommended population size as opposed to that 200 number. So after the cull, we ended up, we think that we now have about 139 deer on the island after culling 100 deer in January. Yeah, and then Chris also asked me to put the relative costs into this figure. So we consulted all of our records, and we think that the immunocontraception project over the 6 or 7 years that it was active cost about $380,000 total, which ends up being about $2,100 per capture on average. There's a huge range in that, depending on how efficient you're being. And then Chris pulled together the number of $24,000 for the cull this past year. So there's a big difference in cost in these two methods. Are there any questions about
just a quick one? Recommended population size, and you came up with whatever it was
120.
Yeah, 120 today, and so that's based on density that the island's built out.
It's based on the density and the amount of deer habitat we have right now. So
if we're increasing, worst case scenario, if we're at, we build out another quarter of the island, that recommended number would obviously
would
be coming down.
Yes, that's a good point. Okay, we can come back to this if there are questions or discussion. This is just an overview of immunocontraception. If there were folks that weren't on the island or really involved in the process when it was occurring, it's a very, very involved process. You might wonder, why is it so expensive? It's expensive because we need to bring in a team of, really well-trained folks who know how to dart the deer. When we dart the deer, we are not darting them with the medication. We're actually darting them with a sedative. So there's a process for capturing the deer, capturing specific deer, going and working up the deer, doing health assessments, injecting the gonocon as a vaccine, which is the immunocontraceptive drug, taking health samples, tracking their vitals. We apply ear tags. If you're wondering why they have those cattle tags, everyone that has ear tags is a deer that has been captured in the past. And then we apply a radio collar because we're required by our permit to track them for about 2 weeks to make sure that they're healthy and survive the process. So it's a very involved process, and especially if you have a lot of individuals out there that you're trying to give them their second booster shot dose, it can be kind of like, just imagine finding a specific deer in these woods out here. Now I will say that the project was successful. We can tell that during the period of time that we did immunocontraception, the number of fawns decreased, the pregnancy rates decreased, our total population number was below the target. So it is successful in that sense that we're able to manage and control the population using immunocontraception. But as I mentioned, the expenses are high, the labor is high, and it gets less effective as you have like a smaller list of deer that need their medication. And it's not permanent. So I want to make that point too, it's like a birth control shot where you have to keep administering it through time. It's not permanent sterilization. So in terms of our recommendations, everything in blue is kind of a direction that I think would be a possible way to go. I think it would be a good idea to reestablish the Deer Task Force. We sort of have been doing that informally already, just through meetings with Chris and Jay and the various experts. And I think to have a goal of establishing kind of like your SAM management plan, let's have a deer management plan where, maybe for 5 years we know what we're doing. So we can plan for it. The organizations involved can, get the personnel they need, get the supplies they need, and just make the whole thing a little more efficient. Members can include representatives from the village, Conservancy, wildlife resources, and some deer management experts. I don't really see it being like a whole public type committee. It would be a very small group. And then for the Conservancy to continue collecting population data. I think those numbers are really important in knowing what our targets should be. And then if we were to pursue immunocontraception, there have been some changes in the permitting procedure. That basically the whole process needs to be done within 1 annual year. So if you apply for a permit in January, the work needs to be done by that December. So with that being said, if we wanted to try to do this December, we're now in March, and we would probably need to start planning ASAP. So that's all I have about deer. Do we have any other questions? Or I know Chris had some maybe points that he wanted to make too.
Well, I just, obviously with this program, and I feel like, we did a pretty good job. I say we, the village, managing it this winter with the call. And obviously you could take it on a cost benefit analysis. I mean, the picture's clear in terms of the cost. But that's, something I think if council we need further discussion and how we move forward with that, whether it's, continuing with the call. I think Dr. DePerno, when he came to our last retreat, he made the point to say, look, you start, if you make a plan, you start it, you stick with it. If it's going to be calling, then you start it and you do it each year. And to some degree, that sort of becomes the expected and the norm. And even though we know there are some folks that don't agree with how we do it, how we did it. But if this council wants us through possibly a deer management plan with working with Beth and the team, wants to consider reestablishment of immunocontraception, I would just be looking for that direction.
I mean, I
It doesn't have to be today, but
think it is safe to say, though, that immunocontraception it just doesn't work forever. And so once you go, like you said, once you go down that path,
You have to stay.
at this point, knowing what we know, if we go down that path, we should stick to that path, and we should put a marker in the budget for whatever that needs to be. And I guess part of that question is, how often if we do it, obviously, if you can get most of the does in a year, how long do you have to wait before you have to do it again? And it appeared to be a few years. It wasn't right away. It wasn't like you start this year, you have to redo them all next year and redo them all the next year and redo them all the next year. There was some gap in there, but you could probably do a bit at a time. But still, I mean, the cost is 10 times what it costs to call.
so I think to really make the program work, if you were to reestablish immuno, is that you still would have to call some number of deer.
And at that point, the people that really are adamant that we don't call are going to look at it and say, well, you might as well not do the contraception.
Possibly.
I mean, if there's some donor out there that wants to donate a few $100,000 a year to do this, then I think that would be something we could consider. But that doesn't appear to be the case. So I know the Friends of Deer did that initially, kind of got that funding started, but that hasn't kept up. And, to me, this is a case where, the village is responsible for the safety of the village and the safety of the forest and all that kind of stuff. And if they're donors that want to make it safer and more humane in their view, then they need to step up and fund it. I'm sure that'll be.
I do have a question, just because I want to make sure we, appropriately size the order of magnitude, right?
Yeah.
Because and I'm not trying to like get you on the math, but like just make sure I understand, because it looked like you said it was 24,000 this year for the call. And I assume most of those are fixed costs, right? It wouldn't have mattered if it was, I know we pay some to have them processed and that kind of stuff, but if it was 120, it wouldn't have been materially different than if it was 80 or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, the largest cost was to have them processed so that
Okay.
they could be distributed to
Okay.
those in need. And all there were some startup costs with getting some equipment.
Yeah.
And then rental of the refrigerator truck. But by and large, the majority of the expense was the process.
I got you. Because I guess what jumped out at me at that is, okay, if it's $24,000 to do a call, that's going to be somewhat of an annual expense or something ish. And I think your other slide said it was 380 over 5 or 6 years. So that's
in those dollars too. So
Yeah,
if
I get
we
it.
like to restart it would be more.
yeah. But again, you're talking, you divide that by 5, 6. What are we talking there? $50,000. So it's 2 to 1. It's not 10 to 1. So I just want to keep us in the.
It really depends on how frequently you have to apply the drugs, right? I mean, so I think that's the part of the question is it, so if we were to hit all the dose, which I know we can't do, but if we did.
Right.
And we got them the next shot a year later. So that's twice we have to get all the dose. The third year, do we do nothing at that point? Or do we have to still go, obviously we're going to go after the ones that don't have tags. And we got to go back.
Yeah, you're going to have some
and it's
grow up
100%
at time, right? Yeah.
percent effective.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're going to be doing something, but I agree with you that it's really not a smooth annual amount.
Right.
You would see in the culling. I mean, it's going to be a lot the first couple of years. It's going to be a little less. And then maybe for a couple of years, you don't have to do anything. And then it's going to pick up again. You do a lot.
You got it. So we're making the same point. I think for budgeting purposes, regardless of what we chose, I'd like to see it be more of a flat item, right? So there's not a
Right.
unexpected hit.
I
Right?
agree.
And whether you use those years or just accrue it in a project fund until a subsequent
I
year.
mean, the deer do reproduce reasonably quickly.
Yeah, they're rabbits. Yeah.
And
That's
some
what we
of them
try.
could reproduce next year.
Yeah.
That's
Along those lines, is it only the reproduction on the island, or do we get deer coming across from Fort Fisher?
There could be some exchange, but we found that the deer that we collar are pretty loyal to the island. It's pretty surprising how contained the population is. And I think that we could see that when we were at full force with immunocontraception, we were seeing the impacts on the total deer population on the island. So even if there is a little bit of exchange, they can also swim. I don't think it's a huge amount that we're just treating them and then they're leaving.
Thank you.
For asking.
Well, we did the collar study first before
Right.
we did to show that.
Right.
Yeah, just for better understanding for myself anyway, the contraceptive process, is it a 2-year process to hit deer twice?
Right.
And then it's effective for 4 years or 5 years? Or is it an ongoing process for like 5 years?
So this is something that's not really known because we're one of the few that have done this in the wild. So we don't know how long that second dose is effective. I think on a population level, because we didn't go back after we stopped in 2020 to see. But we do have some data from prior to 2020. We would send blood for pregnancy samples. And I think that it is still effective for maybe 2 years, at least 2 years. We just don't have enough long-term data to be able to say, this percent has worn off after 3, 4, 5 years.
Beth, do you know how, or do you have any concept of how much coyote population had effect on the number of fawns during this period? Because it seemed like it could have been substantial.
Right. That's a great question because in 2019 is when we had that huge issue with coyotes, right? So we had, everyone was noticing more coyotes. We saw 4 times increase in our coyote sightings on our surveys. And 2019 is where we had the lowest number of fawns on the island. So we think it was probably a combination. And we did see, I saw a coyote with a fawn. So they can and they do take fawns, but we think and we have data actually to show that the coyote population has decreased on the island too. So I don't think they're being as effective. And I think once the population gets to a certain level, they can't control it. Also, once the fawns get to a certain size, the coyotes aren't going to be able to take them.
So we can import some coyotes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
then we'll have that problem again.
Popular.
Yeah, it's really interesting the boom and bust.
Scott, to your point on the cost, that's how we also try to show it on a per deer.
Yes, no, I get it.
Yeah, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the difference too is that Chris already had personnel here, so I don't think you were including the personnel costs in your number. So he had personnel here that were able to just step in and do this work where we had to hire folks. So we had that personnel cost with the immunocontraception
Right.
included in our numbers.
Again.
Did we try to take only does and no bucks? Was it, I mean, I know you can't 100% do that because you can't tell what that deer.
Yeah, I mean, from an operational standpoint, at night with thermal imaging scopes, can't
You just
really
can't
tell.
tell. Yeah.
But out of the 100, we got 61 does and 39 bucks.
Okay.
And then I just wanted to address that question of you still have to call anyway. So as Chris mentioned, I think that what you would want to do and what we did in the past is you start off the immunocontraception program with a call, and that's to bring that overall population low to begin with. Because when you start administering the immunocontraception, you're not taking individuals out of the population, you're just slowing the reproductive rate. So you can reduce the number down and then slow that reproductive rate to maybe nothing so that you're keeping the whole population below target. But you can't take out individuals using immunocontraception. We'll need that. Okay. Anything else? Move on to other topics. Okay. The other thing I wanted to really bring council's attention to is the aquifer. And we know how important the aquifer is. Our drinking water here comes primarily from the aquifer. It's also important to, again, our maritime forest, wildlife on the island. And with the channel deepening issue and the studies that were done, the EIS, it really brought this to the forefront again for the Conservancy because we think that there could potentially be impacts if channel deepening were to occur on the island's aquifer, but it's not really known. So this is one of our longest data sets that we have on Bullhead Island. We have monthly depth to water measurements and we have water quality measurements that go for the past 15 to 20 years. And this is important because, so this is the aquifer, this is the freshwater lens that's under the island, but it is surrounded on all sides by salt water. So if that lens is decreased, then that salt water can start intruding and you don't want salt water in your drinking water. It can also kind of cause permanent issues with the sediment in that area. So this is something that we've been keeping an eye on. And there were a couple concerns this year. So looking at our long-term trends in terms of the volume of water in that aquifer, the depth to water measurements, it seems okay for now. We haven't seen any long-term trends. So there are a number of wells. This is showing all the wells kind of throughout the island that we measure. But the concern that we're starting to have in some areas is the salinity or conductivity measurements. We have in the past had a pattern where there are a couple of wells that always show a little higher conductivity. So that makes sense because these are on the perimeter of the island. So that thinner kind of interface between the freshwater lens and the saltwater, surrounding saltwater. But the concern is that in the past year, these wells have increased significantly in the amount of salinity, not just significantly, but actually kind of an alarming rate. And we need to do some investigation into this and why this might be. One of the issues, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, is that these wells are in not good shape. So there could be potentially some contamination from saltwater kind of in the air, aerosolized saltwater. We want to make sure that that's not what's causing that. That if we're actually seeing this change, that it's actually, real. So this is something that we definitely want to keep an eye on. The other issue is that some of the interior wells that have always been fresh are starting to see a tiny bit of increase in salinity as well. So going from like 1 parts per thousand to 2 parts per thousand, it doesn't sound like very much. Full strength seawater is 35 parts per thousand, in case you're wondering. But when you see that consistently over time, it's a bit of a concern because we don't want to be drinking 2 parts per thousand seawater. In the interest of doing a better job examining the impacts that channel deepening might have on the Bald Head Island aquifer, which was not done as part of the environmental impact statement. We've submitted a grant proposal with Jeremy Patterson from UNCW to the Community Collaborative Research Grant Program. We won't find out until May whether we get it, but Dr. Patterson has said that he still wants to go ahead with some of this work, even if the grant's not funded. And what he's proposing to do is to put some automatic sensors in these wells. So it's not just us going out there monthly or quarterly to take a measurement. We'll have 15-minute readings of salinity. And then he'll be able to put that into a groundwater model to predict, issues on the island with groundwater, but then also put some stressors on that model like sea level rise and potential channel deepening. So we'll let you know if that gets funded. Yeah, but this is my concern. And this is, I've talked a bit about it with the village already with JP, but this type of scenario isn't going to take very clean data. We think that the village should, and they've done a good job coming in and replacing caps on these wells, these PVC caps here. But a lot of these wells just need full replacement. They're corroded, kind of a tetanus issue potentially. And we just think it's a good idea for the long-term information for the island to be able to get really good salinity data. So we have information on which wells need help and happy to work with the field on that. Any questions about aquifer stuff?
It does seem like that's something we probably should consider if we talk about a funding vehicle with the Army Corps that if the deepening did do something to the aquifer, that they would be on the hook for paying for our fresh water.
Right.
That should definitely be included. It shouldn't just be beach nourishment.
Okay. Moving on to the creek water quality. So we also do long-term monitoring of the water quality of the creek. We are out there weekly taking samples from 3 sites. And some of the most important data that we collect is bacteria. So if there are potential contaminants in the water that people are swimming in, they're boating in, their pets are swimming in, we want to make sure to know that for public health reasons and for good, clean areas to recreate. We also want to know what our connections to the Cape Fear River are like and what we're receiving. And this information is also important for things like the dredging that Chris mentioned in the past. That bacterial water quality data was used as justification for dredging the creek mouth and increasing flows. But what I will say is that we actually have had really good water quality for the past, probably 10 years. And so this is nitrate here and phosphate. These are 2 of the nutrients that we keep track of. NC State measures those for us after we collect the data. And you can see that through time, we've had these increases. It's really river water coming in. And a lot of times it's after a storm, after a hurricane, the river water comes in and brings a lot of nutrients with it. But for the most part, the past few years, it's been pretty quiet and we don't have a lot of nutrient inputs coming from the island itself. The bacteria here, this is E. coli. So these numbers going from 50 to 150, these are all below regulatory limits. So even though there's some, variation through time, usually we do see a little more in the summertime. Some of these have been, of concern. And we have strategies in place that if there is a number that's of concern, that we'll let the village know right away. So if there's, maybe a septic tank, I don't, there aren't even very many septic tanks on the island anymore, pump station or something issue, we could let the village know. So really no long-term trends. We don't see any concerns that would probably justify dredging of the mouth. I have other thoughts about, the mouth is narrowing quite a bit, but as of right now, its water quality doesn't seem to be impacted. This is our really great fun project collaboration last year. So we've been talking about installing living shoreline for a number of years. We had various kind of snags in that plan, including this bulkhead here totally failed after one of the hurricanes to be replaced. But with the village's assistance, we were able to install this living shoreline. It looks kind of funny, but these are little tables that are impregnated with, it's a biodegradable concrete-like material. And the idea is that just by putting substrate out there, that these are going to collect oysters growing on them through time, because the oyster larvae are in the water all the time. So they're just going to land on this substrate and start building this up. And then eventually the interior structure will degrade, but we're left with hopefully new oyster reef. And living shorelines are advantageous because they can help reduce erosion. They can help with water quality as well. But when you have living organisms there, they can move as, for example, sea level moves. So they're not a hard stop in the same way that a bulkhead is. So we did evaluation. It was installed in February 2025. We did evaluation with one of our interns, Tabitha, in October. You can see kind of the difference here. So this is before and this is after. You can see it being encrusted by little baby oysters. And then she measured all the little baby oysters. You can see there are a variety of sizes. So this means that we had like multiple doses of oysters coming and landing on the living shoreline and starting to grow up. And some of them are getting pretty big. We've also seen increased sedimentation behind the living shoreline. Don't have all those data together yet, but it's looking like it's being really effective already. And it's not even, now we're just at a year afterwards. So it's pretty exciting. And, we're interested in looking into more of those projects in the creek and maybe extending this one. And then looking into more nature-based solutions for things like stormwater and bulkheads and things like that. If we can move away from hardened structures and more towards nature-based solutions, they're going to be a little more adaptable. All right, moving on quickly to our beach vitex project. This is another beast that's been on our deck for a really long time. So beach vitex is a beautiful plant, but is not native to Bald Head Island. It was originally introduced, I think, starting in South Carolina as a form of erosion control. But the problem with beach vitex is that it has these huge runners that go across the surface of the sand, but it doesn't really go deep into the sand like our native plants do. So it's been part of our plan since about 2005 to get rid of this stuff. And we've been doing it slowly but surely. But in the past, I'd say 5 years, we've had the most success with it. Allison put these really nice figures together, and this is the number of sites. The green ones are the ones that we're still actively treating. They're decreasing through time. But this past year, we tried a new method where, anyway, I won't get into the details. It's a new method. It's really great. Involves digging it up completely. And we're really hoping that this number is going to be very low this next year. But overall, we've had a decrease in about 53% in the total number of sites since 2020. We're going to keep doing that until it's all done. We talked about priorities briefly, and I'll get to them, but we also do monitoring of our alligator population on the island, and we do a lot of education about wildlife safety with alligators. We worked really closely with public safety this past year, and it was really good because we had a lot of little babies that were showing up all over the place. But we do monitoring every year of our alligator population, and we think that there are about 35 individuals out there on the island, and most of them are juveniles. So most of these are less than 4 feet long. Here are our subadults and adults. This isn't really a significant increase in the number of adults, but as a whole, the population has been increasing since we started this study. Our biggest concern with the alligators is not really an alligator problem, it's a people problem, as most wildlife management issues are. It's really fishing in the lagoons. We had an individual die, a necropsy was done a couple of years ago, and its gut was absolutely full of lead fishing weights, and it had toxic concentrations of lead in its blood that were like 3 times the lethal amount of lead. So all that lead is also in our golf course lagoons, and it's also entering our water system potentially. And also it's a danger to humans, the humans that are doing that fishing in the lagoons. So we're going to keep responding with our wildlife response. I hope public safety keeps responding when there's fishing in lagoons. It's a hard ongoing problem because every week in the summer we have a different group of people and they want to fish in lagoons. So but that's the biggest issue I see right now with the alligators.
Do you know if the stores on the island sell lead weights?
Probably.
They do. Because there's alternatives.
Okay.
I wonder if it would be worth just requesting that they not sell lead weights, but sell only non-lead weights. I mean, it's not going to reduce the fishing in the lagoons, but at least it would keep some of the lead out of the water supply if possible.
That's an idea. We can start those conversations. All right, so back to coyotes. So I mentioned how from 2018 to 2019, we saw a huge uptick in the coyote population. And then we went back into all of our old data to see, if we had any other data about coyotes. And coyotes were first seen on the island about 2007, 2008. I think someone saw one. So they didn't really have a significant population here until, maybe mid 2015 or so. These are all foxes. So we've seen a shift in red foxes to coyotes kind of occupying that same niche. But 2019 is when the coyotes really became a concern because they were attacking sea turtle nests and causing significant mortality of sea turtles. And then, as I mentioned, we did our surveys. So these are just our deer surveys. When we're out there looking for deer, we also write down whenever we see a coyote or a fox. So it's good, kind of supplemental data. But we did see a decrease from 2021 to 2022. Actually didn't see any on our surveys. So we were kind of curious what was going on. We talked to Fort Fisher because we are connected to Fort Fisher. And being a state agency, they do lethal trapping of coyotes. So they remove coyotes to help protect their sea turtles and also their shorebirds. So these are their numbers of trapping. I need to get that updated. So we suspected that there was possibly a connection between our population and their population that was kind of impacting that flow of individuals. And then we talked to Dr. Liz Kierka from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And we've now done 2 separate mercury capture studies using coyote scat to look at their population. So basically we go out, we collect their poop, and then we have it genetically analyzed. And we figure out the number of individuals that there are based on the different genetic sequences that there are. And right now, it looks like we have about 6 coyotes on Bald Head Island. And that sounds like kind of a small number, but they have a really huge home range. So these are, where we collected samples from this whole family, and this is where we collected samples from this whole family, including we got hairs from Fort Fisher when they did the trapping this past year. So we know that we have individuals from this family that are related to the Fort Fisher. They're first-degree relatives of the Fort Fisher coyotes. And then there's a second family on the island right now. There was another family like 3 years ago that's not on the island anymore. And the weird thing is that the individuals in 2022, there was no overlap with individuals found in 2024. So we have some of the same families, but none of the same individuals. So maybe they're left, died, or something. So we'll continue doing these surveys, doing our deer surveys. I don't think that we need to do the genetic thing every year. It might be interesting to do it again in a few years and see where we are, but about 6 coyotes on the island right now. Shorebird conservation is an important collaboration that we do with the state. So we go out and we put postings out to make sure that people keep dogs and individuals out of the nesting areas of our shorebird nests. So all these shorebirds nest directly on the sand. Wilson's plovers, least terns, American oyster catchers are nesting directly on that sand. Most of the individuals are found around that terminal groin area. We have nice big wide beaches now. There are individuals that nest or at least forage at access 1, 2. So we might want to think about that if there are any plans to use that sand. But the good news is that our Wilson's plovers pairs have been increasing with the numbers of breeding pairs and the number of babies that they're producing. Cute little ball toothpicks. And we've had some least terns thinking about using our beach. Like 2 years ago, we had a big colony. This past year, they were like, maybe, maybe not. So we have been getting a few least terns the past few years, but not the huge colonies that we used to get like in 2015, 2016. Oh, I did want to say also, you may be aware that the BHA got rid of their dog park. So I don't know if people think about this, but that might have unintended consequences with the number of dogs on beaches, because that's a place for them to let their dogs run free. So we always try to do education to the public, but we'll probably be increasing that this year as well. And then our diamondback terrapin conservation. So we participate in statewide surveys using kayaks. And if anyone's interested, we always take volunteers. It's really fun to get that out there in a kayak and look for these really cute, gregarious little turtles. So these are a species of conservation concern. They get trapped in crab pots. And with Village's help, we've been giving out these terrapin excluder devices to keep the terrapins from going in the crab pots where they can drown. We definitely have a lot of terrapins in Bald Head Island waters. They really like this area up here. And sometimes we see sea turtles on these surveys too. So get in touch and do surveys with us. Allison gave some really nice presentations this past year and had talked to potential collaborators about terrapins. And then we've been continuing to give out and install the TEDs on these crab pots. So we just think it's a good idea to continue these surveys and giving out the TEDs. I do think that the people that use crab pots on the island are probably not the biggest issue when it comes to terrapin mortality. It's probably more of the commercial crabbers. So we're planning on increasing our conversations with DMF this year to see what's going on with regulations of the commercial crabbers and their crab pot. And then this past year, we have been very involved in conversations about the channel deepening as well. We have a lot of concerns about this potential project. We reviewed the draft EIS, conversations with the village and their staff. We submitted public comments to the Corps of Engineers and DCM. The biggest concerns that we've brought up are, thinking that the modeling of the sediment dynamics was kind of inadequate when it comes to Bald Head Island. We have concerns about the amount of dredging increasing and impacts to sea turtles and other wildlife. One issue with sand placement is whenever sand placement occurs, there is, kind of some escarpments that form as the beach returns to equilibrium. And the village has been putting those costs for coming out and managing that scarp that will allow the sea turtles to access the beach. So those costs should be included in the mitigation plan. I mentioned unknown impacts of the aquifer, and then the economic justification we thought was inadequate. As you all know, the consistency determination is on hold right now. So yeah, hopefully we'll be available to deal with any concerns and be responsive to this issue as it continues. So Peter asked for us to bring up anything the village can help with. And I would just say, keep us in the loop, be like being involved in conversations if there are projects coming down the pike that we could help with, especially if they impact the environment. Please keep us involved. So beach management, especially as it affects sea turtles, if there are building projects in the marsh and dune, stormwater and wastewater issues, love to be involved in those conversations. New developments that affect the tree canopy, understory, And then state and federal policy issues affecting BHI. And Chris and I have talked about having maybe more just regular meetings between the Conservancy and the village, just to make sure that we're dating each other. We'd love to be more involved with land preservation, with SILT, and land management planning in general, and then working together as we do, but continuing to do so with enforcing environmental ordinances, just sea turtle related ordinances and building ordinances, things like that. Thanks for asking. All right, any questions? Great, probably.
Thanks for writing the letter. The letter you guys wrote is great.
Thanks.
And I think some of the points you guys made were certainly reflected in the DCN response. So I think that was a very helpful letter.
Thank you. All right.
Nice job, Beth.
Thank you.